Before we properly begin here, there's a couple of housekeeping things to address. As you may have noticed, we are on Zoom today, and this is my first time using Zoom in this panel format. So I've learned a couple of things real quick. First, really only the panelists and myself will be able to speak and use the standard chat function, if you are familiar with it. However, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So if you do have questions at any point during the talk, please feel free to put them in there. Uh, Dan and Bronte, who are not on video right now, but they'll be working behind the scenes to field questions. So if you have questions about technology issues, they can answer it right there in the Q&A chat. If it's questions about the discussion, the topic, that we will bring some of those questions back at the end for a little bit of Q&A. Right. I don't think there is much else other, or on the tech file. We are on a tight schedule, like I said, so at some point, if I have to jump in and curtail discussion, I do apologize. This is not going to be an exhaustive discussion of this topic, so let this panel represent the beginning of a serious and critical look at what we want for the Yukon and its citizens related to the mining industry. I do have a couple of quick opening comments. So I'll introduce kind of the topic, and then I'll toss it over to our panelists. So without further ado, and do we have anything from Bronte or Dan? Anything last minute? All right, then let's get going. So every year, Roundup is held down in Vancouver, and Yukon leaders leave the territory and talk about the future of mining in the Yukon with industry representatives from around the world. Roundup's theme, I understand, this year is securing our future, which, given the state of global affairs, I don't think anybody is surprised by. But Roundup is not a well-rounded discussion of the future of mining. It's a discussion held by those in the industry of mining and leaves out so many Yukoners who are deeply affected by the future of mining in the Yukon. The NDP in Yukon believe that a secure future for mining needs to include this well-rounded discussion hosted in the Yukon by Yukoners. To be blunt, the mining industry has not brought a secure future to the Yukon. It has left a legacy of severe environmental damage and high cost to taxpayers, to the public. You don't have to take my word for it. In 2024, the Canadian Auditor General released a report on contaminated sites in the north, citing the enormous cost to taxpayers because of these abandoned sites in the Yukon. And if you're unfamiliar with some of these projects that have become environmental disasters, there's a list of them. Wolverine jumps to mind. I actually worked for several years at Minto Mine before it was abandoned. And most recently, Chief Hope, who you'll hear from later, and the citizens of Na-Cho have had to bear the impact of Victoria Gold's Eagle Mine disaster. The mining industry's legacy of harm in the Yukon has been enabled by Yukon government's legislation and enforcement practices. In the wake of Victoria Gold's heap leach disaster, as representatives of the Yukon legislature, the Yukon NDP feels a deep responsibility to all Yukoners to have an honest conversation about what a secure future for the territory's land, water, and people looks like. With that said, I'm going to move on and introduce our guests. So we have three panelists today. The first is the leader of the Yukon NDP and MLA for Takini Copper King, Kate White. We also have with us today, coming from the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and I'm probably going to get this wrong here, Tsleil-Waututh nations. She's the chief of the First Nation of Na-Cho, Chief Dawna Hope. And then we also have, following up, and now retired from the role of mining coordinator at Yukon Conservation Society after more than 2 decades. He's an engineer and an environmental advocate, Lewis Rifkind. So I think at this point, Kate, you're up first. I'll give you about 3 minutes to kind of do an introduction, some opening comments.
Thanks, Colin. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. I'm joining you from my office next to the Yukon River, nestled in a dark corner on the traditional territory of the Kwamandun First Nation and the T'Ong Council. So Yukon, we really need to talk about mining. So we're hosting this conversation today as industry is hosting the AME Roundup in Vancouver. And to be clear, that's a promotional event for the global mining industry. And I chose not to attend this year. The Yukon NDP believe that we need to hear from all voices affected by mining in the territory and not just industry. To be clear, we meet with folks within the mining industry and the boards and the chambers that represent them, some who have joined us online to listen today. And we encourage inclusive, informed conversation about issues, all issues. Victoria Gold's heap leach disaster at the Eagle Mine last summer was a terrible wake-up call. Yukon must do better. But to be clear, this isn't the first mining disaster since the Yukon took over the responsibility of all aspects of the mining industry since the devolution transfer agreement in the early 2000s. The Yukon government is responsible for the legal framework that license mines that have left or are leaving toxic legacies. Mines like the Wolverine and the Eagle Mine, or the ongoing financial responsibility of the Minto Mine. And that legal framework is part of the problem Yukon legislatures, folks like me who are elected, can help fix. Because right now, Yukoners are financially responsible for these sites. Unlike Faro or Nansen, where it's the responsibility of all Canadians, anything licensed after devolution is a responsibility solely of Yukoners. And Yukon has obligations under the umbrella final agreement and devolution that have never been actualized. Successor resource legislation, land use planning, and honoring Chapter 14 water management. Reconciliation would be to honor those commitments with action. We haven't seen that yet. We've all witnessed the ongoing leadership from the First Nation of Na-Cho Nyäk since the disaster on their lands, as they've called for government accountability. They asked for a public inquiry into Eagle Mine, and when that was ignored, they asked the Auditor General of Canada to perform a performance audit regarding the role of the Yukon government and the Government of Canada in assessing, regulating, and overseeing Victoria Gold Corporation's Eagle Gold Mine, and implementing, or in this case, failing to implement the process and promises of federal devolution in the Yukon with respect to non-renewable resource management. The Yukon NDP echoed those calls, and after speaking with industry, we have pushed for a public inquiry into the closure of the Wolverine Mine, the Minto Mine, and the Eagle Mine, because there was only one consistent player involved in each of those mines, and that, of course, is the Yukon government. Yukon's current Miners Lien Act leaves Yukon businesses and contractors last in line for payment when a mine is abandoned. And as of January 3rd, $60 million in liens have been filed against Victoria Gold. We saw something very similar play out with Yukon Zinc, and I can tell you it wasn't good. So the Yukon NDP believe that mining is an important part of the economy. We believe that we can have better mining practices based on well-informed and designed policies in the public interest for the benefit of future generations, and maintaining trusting relationship with peoples and nations and lands and waters of the Yukon. The way we're currently doing mining threatens our land, water, and way of life, and it isn't working. So we believe that we all have a collective responsibility to make changes that will protect these things. And this is just not the responsibility of private industry. It's the role of government as the mining regulator. We need mining rules and regulations that will ensure a healthy environment and community for all Yukoners. Yukon First Nations must be at the table and leading the way on these conversations and on decision-making about what happens on their territory. So we know business as usual is not sustainable, and we know that we can do better. So we're here to start a conversation about what that can look like. And I'm so happy to be joined today by Chief Hope, Chief of the Na-Cho Nyäk. I'm so glad you could join us, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. I would like to change the perception of what mining could be. If we all work together to ensure environmental sustainability and the utmost best practices to provide the least negative impacts possible to our lands, waters, and even fish and wildlife, mining could truly be beneficial and environmentally sustainable for generations to come. Um, this is an opportunity to develop true partnerships with economic benefits, which are identified by community, embraced by community, reflect a healthy, inclusive, thriving community who share commitment towards reconciliation in the spirit and respect, stewardship, and sustainability through working together in efforts of environmental sustainability, local investment, and community benefits, not only for now, but for future generations and beyond. We need to break free of the stigmatism of old colonial ways and hierarchical structures. To me, within each of our modern treaties, we are all equals. Not one government is more important than the other. We all matter together. We just have different strengths that we bring to the table, and we need each other, really. Um, we are all here for our people, for our communities, and ultimately, we're supposed to be one nation, indivisible. Because really, who knows the spaces that we live in better than the people who live in those local areas? Day by day, we live on, season after season. That's our experience. And that's why this collaboration is so important. No more antiquated legislative practices. We know those systems are broken because they don't include us. They don't include us as equals in that playing field as prescribed through our final agreement. We are self-governing nations with modern treaties. We are Indigenous nation governments. If modern treaties like the Yukon Final Agreements were implemented and recognized in the spirit and intent of the signing of those agreements, the Yukon would ultimately be rich in benefits and hold resources to their true value. Mining is not going anywhere, but neither are we. Neither are the First Nation people, and neither are the local people. The biggest reason I like to partake in the Roundup and geoscience is, oddly, they showcase the best of the best, the highest standards. They hold people up on pedestals. I would like to see those standards held up by the industry across the whole industry so that they start doing better and less impacts to the environment and ultimately to the future generations. So I look forward to more talking and discussion in this. And thank you for having me.
Thank you, Chief Hope. Yeah, let's turn it over to Lewis Rifkind. Take it away.
Great, great, thank you. Yes, I mean, I echo what has been said, but I also think, as far as mining in the Yukon goes, there seems to have been a huge emphasis on mining above all. I think the approach should be more mining if necessary, but not necessarily mining. And one way to sort of implement that approach is to do land use planning. We're woefully behind on land use planning. Once we've figured out what the land we can be used for, and we can then decide where mining could perhaps occur, that would get rid of a lot of the short-term conflicts we're seeing at the moment. When you do land use planning, you protect the land, you protect the animals, you assign priorities to certain types of land. So land isn't necessarily turned into parks, but it is turned, it can be used for other industrial uses, not as destructive as mining. There also has to be a much greater emphasis on the new mining legislation or regulations. They've been in the works for, I forget how many years now, and it's going to be a couple more years until we finally see, the final product. And it's sort of happening behind closed doors, where there's delays. We're going to see an election happen. There's all this reasons to put off these new mining legislation and associated regulations, and that's not appropriate. We're dealing with laws and regulations that are a century old. And we've seen the results. Kate explained quite eloquently the disasters that we've had with the three major mines, and that doesn't include the damage that all the exploration and placer mining is doing. We also need much tougher environmental assessment and water board licensing. The entities charged with doing it at the moment need greater resources, and they need to expand their mandate. There has been an emphasis recently on not just environmental assessment, but also doing economic assessment. Are these projects, from a dollars and cents point of view, actually beneficial to the Yukon over the lifespan of the mine? And you could take one look at the 3 mines that have failed under YG's mandate, and they're going to become financial sinkholes. If a proper environmental assessment had been done at the start, they probably would not have been approved. And finally, there's a process where YG issues mining licenses. That has to be much tougher too. There is a perception, at least, that that's just sort of a rubber stamp type process. We have to change that. YG should be doing a much tougher job in reviewing these proposed mines when they come forward, and have the courage to say no to the ones that that are going to cause problems for us later on. That's it.
Thank you, Lewis. Yeah, okay, so that kind of concludes the introductory comments. There's a lot of ground to cover here. Like I said at the top, this is not going to be an exhaustive discussion of every one of these issues. It can't be. But as we've already heard, like there's a litany of potential issues that need immediate attention within this discussion, and then through legislature in the Yukon. We've kind of come to our open panel discussion now. So we've got about 20 minutes slated for our panelists to kind of talk about this, some of these issues. So I suppose we can return back to Kate and go ahead, lead us off.
Sure. One of the things that both of you mentioned, Chief Hope and Lewis, is you talked about the necessity of land use planning. And so I have to tell you that when I was elected in 2011 and everything was new and I didn't fully understand our responsibilities of Yukon government, whether we talk about devolution or the umbrella final agreement and signed final agreements, those modern treaties that you mentioned, Chief Hope, one of the things that became woefully apparent, because when I first got elected, we were deep in the thralls of the Peel River watershed land use plan. And the contentious nature of that, including the fact that it was First Nations and environmental groups who took Yukon government to court based on the plan that they were going to implement. And so I'm interested in knowing, Chief Hope, from your perspective, like, where do we go now with land use planning? So we know that we have the North Yukon successfully done. We've got the Peel, that was done. Dawson has been dragging, the Dawson Regional Land Use Plan is in process, but we haven't got that fully done. So you're a nation who has been requesting land use planning. Where do you stand on that issue?
We still very much want land use planning. We have been asking for land use planning ultimately for over 30 years. Aside from while we're waiting and keeping that in the pauses, I guess, for now, until we get engaged fully and complete all those plans. Water is, of course, one of the utmost importance for our nation. It has a chapter to itself within our final agreement. And I believe that is another area that we need to start getting a better understanding once we have our land use plans established. Start planning our resources better, understanding the needs of how that the environment requirements, and just like a bank account, a water balance should just do that. It should balance itself. The environment should get theirs first. Whatever is left, then we can decide what benefits or who gets to use those. But once a watershed is full, we have to find those limits to make sure that we secure ecosystem functions so that they're manageable and not broken to a point where we can't turn them around anymore. We're seeing more and more of our lands and ultimately our waters being destroyed, and we need to start making sure that we fix that for future generations before it's gone.
Lewis, you want to jump in with land use planning?
Yes, I mean, it's critical, and I get angry that we're so quick to approve mines. I mean, how many have we approved since, the late 90s? And in the meantime, to be honest, three land use plans, is that right? Yes, you mentioned that. And now we seem to be in limbo. What's next? No one seems to know. We're quick to chuck resources at approving mines, but not at land use planning. Let's change the priority. And oddly enough, once we've done land use planning, mines will be easy to approve because we know where we want the mining to occur. Chief Hope mentioned the whole issue of water, and she's right. We abuse the water we have up here. If you talk to people who live in southern Canada or in the lower 48, their water is precious. It's metered. They charge a lot for it. And then when they learn how we just hand out water licenses with virtually no cost associated with it, we treat water like there's an infinite amount and it's going to last forever. Well, it's not. And we have to start respecting it more. And once we get a handle on how we issue water licenses and we assign a much greater value to water, a lot of environmental concerns will be addressed as well. We can ensure there's ensure for fisheries. We can ensure there's enough for the boreal forest. We can ensure there's enough for animals. And I would argue more importantly, that there's enough for us to live. So we have to start dealing with it in a more holistic approach when it comes to things like that.
So when in 2005-06, I lived in Australia, and the reason this is relevant is that country had been in a drought for it's been in drought for as long as colonial recorded history. And it was such an issue that they were working on large-scale desalination plants, so to make sure that there would be accessible drinking water for people. And I remember being in Australia thinking, holy cow, it's not going to be gold that Yukon has that people want, it's going to be water. And when we talk about ecosystem sustainability and we talk about the rights of environment, the one thing that everything needs is water. And one of the big issues that I in my role have talked about, for many years is the importance of good, concrete, understandable baseline information around water. And the needs of water. So making sure, for example, as we talk about in your territory, Chief Hope, there's cyanide in the water. That is something that no one ever thought could happen with that heap leach failure at Eagle Mine. It's not just one issue. It's a cascading set of issues. And one of the biggest ones is, of course, how does this affect the water? Right? We know water moves through the ground. We know it travels. And so there's lots of question around water. So I love that you brought up the importance of water. And I think, a lot of what we do in the Yukon planning and going forward has to be around the sustainability of water. One of the reasons why the Yukon NDP pushed back against hydraulic fracturing is because it actually removes water from that system. And to Lewis's point, you're right. It's not infinite. Water, there is there is a lot of water, but it is not everlasting, and that's of concern for sure.
And really, that's one of the problems is water is so important. It's so precious, yet we don't even really have an understanding of water on the surface, let alone groundwater systems, which we can't see. And in most cases, we're impacting those without even knowing it. With the modernization of legislation, the roller coaster mining boom and bust could be better controlled or potentially eliminated. Better understanding of water availability through developing robust water strategies and budgets within land use plans can go a long way. Within watersheds, to understand limits before irreversibility impacting ecosystem services, and closing the loop with appropriate reclamation and total restoration of impacts to lands.
Yeah, it's one thing that the current system does is when we issue water, like when the Yukon Water Board issues a water license, say for a major mine, it typically just considers the mine. That's how their legislation is set up. They can't do much more than that. We don't take a watershed approach. We have to start doing that. In certain areas, and I'm thinking particularly the Dawson region, we're seeing whole like stream valleys being basically wiped out because we're issuing water licenses piecemeal. And if that was the only project that was going in the valley, it would be okay. But instead, we're starting, you see 20 water licenses issued, for example, in placer mining. And by the time it gets to, where it enters the Yukon River, uh, we've destroyed a whole valley because we've issued cumulative water licenses. We don't have a good way to deal with a watershed approach when it comes to mineral development, and that has to be addressed. You can do it through land use planning, you can do it through a new mineral legislation, or you can do it by sort of looking at how the water board issues water licenses and changing that or doing a major tweak.
I
I
think
think
that cumulative effects within a watershed also has to take into account uh, things like the overall effects of climate change and other extenuating circumstances. For instance, the thing we're dealing with in Yukon is the 7-year ban on salmon fishing. That indicates a massive decline, an emergency, a global emergency situation related to that species. That any small impact will have a much larger felt impact on that system. So we have to take that into account some way.
Yeah,
I think
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I think when I appreciate that you brought up the issue of salmon, Colin, because if you go to the Teslin Clinic and you talk to someone my age may have a memory of a fish camp on the lake, but people younger than me will not. That is a community that hasn't been able to harvest salmon in a real and meaningful way in decades. And we, I think about the privilege of traveling and having and meeting, with chiefs and councils and communities and municipalities and towns across the territory. And something that has definitely woven its way through is that absence of salmon. Reading the stories of friends who talk about what they remember, but knowing that their children don't have that same opportunity. And that's tragic. So although there has been something now where I appreciate that Alaska now is honoring that salmon ban. Yukon, we First Nations in Yukon have led a long time and have willingly put in their own provisions to stop the harvest, trying to bring back those populations. So, I think about, I mean, Chief Hope, you must have stories from your nation of decisions made for wildlife management or water management or things, and so it has been a really big deal. Absolutely.
That's for sure. For me, for myself, my traditional knowledge is even when I was a kid, I remember the rivers used to run red with salmon.
Yeah, I've seen reports like, back in the 40s or 50s, there wasn't much written down about the how vibrant and alive the rivers were with salmon at spawning time, but there were the occasional ones. And I remember reading one about I think it was the Mayo River, the one that goes off the Stewart into Mayo Lake proper, and it was just teeming with salmon. And now there's nothing. I mean, yeah, the loss is incredible.
I think one of the things that you've both pointed out, and to be honest, I hear this from lots of communities, but it's taking that big picture look, right? So Lewis, you talked about the importance of looking at watershed sustainability. Chief Hope, you said similar things. When we talk about the need for land use planning and the fact that that was a commitment, right? Again, I think reconciliation would be putting actions behind those. We saw, Chief Hope, in your territory, an ongoing issue with what I'll refer to as the spot land use plan around the Beaver River land use plan that didn't even take into account that it was in a bigger watershed. That if one spot was, if one spot was planned, but it didn't take into account the surrounding areas, um, like that leads to all sorts of conflict, and all sorts of questions, not just for nations and Yukoners, but for industry itself. Chief Hope, you had a really beautiful vision of what you thought mining could be in the Yukon. You talked about, let's go back to my notes. You talked about that it could be environmentally sustainable for future generations. You talked about mining that could work for Yukoners. Um, and I wonder if you could maybe expand a bit on how you could see us working together for that.
Again, just truly implementing our final agreements. Within those agreements, they were negotiated by both all three levels of our government, for not just the First Nation of Na-Cho, Nyäk Dun people, but for Yukoners as a whole, how to use and how to live in within the traditional territory of the Na-Cho, Nyäk Dun. While since the Eagle Gold catastrophic disaster on June 24th, we have requested a halt in mining. But I just wanted to clarify that ultimately, we know that we need mining. We all have cars, we have computers, and we do business on a regular basis. We live 410 kilometers away from the centralized base that we have to go to meetings and buy groceries once in a while from. However, we should be respecting those resources for their true value, and not just for a handful of people to just make millions upon millions and then walk away, leaving taxpayers with the cleanup bill and a toxic generational legacy that I have to pass on to my generations. Ultimately, we don't want to stop mining. We just want things, and we want it to we want to always be striving to do our best at all that we can be, including mining practices. If we can do better, let's do better. We got to start thinking about future generations and making sure that things are secure, especially clean water for them, for future generations. Clean water, without it, we're all dust, including lands, the flora, fauna, fish, wildlife. It doesn't matter. We all need water, and that's just the fact.
One thing that strikes me is so with the umbrella final agreement, which was, you know, of course the overarching document where your final agreement was worked within, you talk about the spirit and intent, which I 100% agree. But one of those commitments, both with the umbrella final agreement and the commitment when those modern treaties were signed, of course during devolution, early 2000s, was so people will hear me say it's successor resource legislation, but really what it means is it means new minerals legislation. To Lewis's point, it's very outdated. So again, I've been in this role for a long time, and in opposition. My predecessor and mentor, Elizabeth Hanson, she was involved in some of those negotiations, and she always talked about the importance of both the intent and the spirit of the words that were chosen. And so I would say I grew up into the politician I am with that kind of influence. And I think that commitment to successor resource legislation is so critical and so important that I actually included that in my 2021 confidences apply with the Liberals. I did have a 2-year timeline, just for folks listening. I'm not oblivious. I didn't think it could happen in 2 years. But one of the things that I really appreciate is that it's got First Nations, it's got industry representatives, it's got environmental representatives, and this is something that's going forward. Because I think if we talk about a future where mining lives up to those expectations that we have, we need to make sure that we have rules and regulations that are enforceable, that set that standard. And I know industry is interested in doing that. So any thoughts about new mineral legislation?
Yeah, you raise actually a good point. Once we have new mineral legislation, and let's face it, it's going to be much better than what we got now, and there might be a perception it will be tougher, more rigorous. But one thing it does do is it will provide certainty to industry. And industry likes certainty. They're not concerned that the rules will change halfway through their operation or that there'll be new issues coming up that they haven't addressed. So once you get a really tough legislative and regulatory regime in place, if industry can meet it, they are happy because they know the playing field has been organized for them. They know the rules. So it might seem that the new legislation would appear tough. Of course, it's going to be tough. We're dealing with stuff that's 100 years old. Technology has changed. Our understanding of the environment has changed. Mining technology has changed. And I would argue some mining technology has changed for the better. But it has to be used and it has to be implemented. So once we get some of this new legislation, and we have to do it much quicker than we're doing now, I think not only will Yukoners of all types be happy, but industry will also be happy as well because they will have certainty.
I agree. And that certainty is not only for industry, but I believe it's for Yukon First Nations and Yukoners on a whole. Really, the vision of Together Today of Our Children Tomorrow was a community vision. That the final agreement and each individual final agreement followed was framed after. Those agreements were developed as tools for Yukoners to come together and collaboratively shape a common future for a society respectful of all people that will sustain this place for generations to come. Negotiators for Yukon Indigenous people assisted in encompassing that vision and reiterating those values. Although our elders had a goal in mind. They wanted to protect the land, the water, and the wildlife, which together are the heart of our culture and our language. Practically in the spirit and intent that this was meant to have, influencing over future through control of land, water, and resources.
All right, I think that brings us to our 20-minute time for the open discussion. I want to thank all three of you for what you've offered. I've been trying to keep an eye on the chat, and there's a good few questions. We're going to get to a couple of them here, though we don't have a ton of time to get to them. It's very clear, as I mentioned at the top of all this, that this is just the beginning, not the end of an important, critical look at how we do mining in the Yukon, who benefits, who's left out, and how we can correct that. So yeah, I'm gonna first, before we get to the moderated questions here, I'm gonna throw it back to Kate, Chief Hope, and Lewis here for a quick 2-minute kind of closing statements. Kate, please take it away.
I feel like this conversation could go for a lot longer than it is right now. I think there's a couple realities, right? Which is the current minerals legislation has allowed these really bad things to happen. It's not okay that the Yukon Water Board and Nyäk demanded cyanide treatment capacity at Eagle Mine, but the Yukon government didn't enforce that requirement, right? That's a tragic mistake. That shouldn't have been the situation. When we talk about land use planning and we talk about the future, it is about trying to find that certainty, right? Where mining companies know where they're going to be welcome, and it's going to be much easier to go through. When we talk about new minerals legislation, there's all these things that have to play together, and the reality is that no one person is ever going to have the answer. And so having conversations like today, seeing the engagement in the chat, and I know that there's questions coming. This just has to be one of the many conversations, but I really think those have to happen here in Yukon, right? I think I think government, whatever stripe it is, should be having these conversations here. It's fine that they go out of territory and they have those conversations on a larger stage, but really they have to happen here at home with Yukoners. And so I'm glad today to be here and to be joined by two people that I respect so much, and knowing that there's folks online that I will continue to learn from. So I'm just grateful for the day, and thank you, Chief Hope, and thank you, Lewis, and thanks to folks who've joined us.
I completely agree. Yukoners, that is our space, and it was gifted to us through not only our final agreement and land claim, but also a parallel for Yukon government to gain their kind of, you can call it land claim, through getting all the authorities that they did through the political realms in establishing their government, aside from having Ottawa continue to make decisions for us. But ultimately, we want to grow a healthy, cooperative community and showcase community-led partnerships, true partnerships, community growth supported legacies of best practices, and leading to a community proudly sharing our natural beauty, our culture and heritage, and the friendliness of the Yukon, and how we can share and prosper together for generations, and uphold our culture, taking care of stewardship, protecting the land for generations to come. And that's the kind of legacies that I want to leave, instead of ones where our grandchildren are still cleaning up messes that we're creating today. So thank you.
I mean, what can I say? That's certainly spot on. From a quote unquote retired environmentalist point of view, I think the what we should be doing is getting land use planning done. We have to do more of it. We have to chuck more resources at it, because once we get that done, a lot of the problems that we experience with the mining industry will have been resolved. That being said, we also need new mining regulations. Operating with century-old legislation, it's a joke. I mean, you tell people this outside the Yukon, and they laugh at us. I mean, it's sort of like it's quaint in a way, but from an environmental and socioeconomic point of view, it's terrible. And then we also need much better and much tougher environmental assessment, water licensing processes, and mining license reviews. They have to be much more thorough than what we're doing at the moment. And we just have to look at the last three mines that have failed as our exhibits A, B, and C. So we certainly have to up our game on that. It's not just the mining industry that has to improve their performance. We have to improve our performance as well when engaging with the mining industry and reviewing and approving their various projects.
Well, thank you once again to our panelists today, and thank you so much for everyone being here. We have just a few more minutes here, so we're going to do a moderated question and answer. So I've got a couple of questions that have been pulled from the Q&A section. So I'm going to toss this out to the panel, and please do your best to keep your answers short. I know this isn't a very complex topic or anything like that. So, but yeah, we do have a limited time. So, all right, moving to the first question here. So yeah, Yukon government is currently rewriting Yukon mineral legislation. There haven't been many public updates on the process, and there seems to be continual delays. What is the Yukon NDP doing to push that process along and ensure that real change comes about through the new legislation? As an example, abolishing free entry, staking, and including language from UNDRIP.
I'll start and then other people can fill in. So I will say that the Yukon NDP kickstarted it. I mean, it should have happened decades before me, but here we are with the situation with the minority government. The interesting thing I'll say is that this to me is really being driven by First Nations at a table, making discussions about or moving towards the intent of what they want. Free entry, I think, is going to that has to be a thing of the past. United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, I continue to champion for. But I think ultimately the question for folks online today and all Yukoners is, do you know where the Liberals and the Yukon Party stand on this issue towards new minerals legislation? Because there's an election this year, and we're not going to get to new minerals legislation before that. So I'm committed. I have been committed. I will continue to be committed to work with everyone towards this. But it is going to take more than just the Yukon NDP to push back and to keep it on track. And so that's the invitation to everyone else to continue to advocate for it.
Yeah, it's. I mean, when I was with the environmental groups, I was part of one of the subcommittee tables taking part with the new mineral legislation discussion. And let's see, I've been retired for 6 months now, and I don't have a clue where the new mineral legislation is. There hasn't been much communication or transparency of the process. And how can we push for something to be finished or completed if we have no idea where in the stages they are? It's interesting, and also to ask other groups and business and industry where they stand on the new mineral legislation is really tough, because we don't have an idea of which direction it's headed. How is it going to be drafted? There has to be much more transparency.
I guess the only thing I have to add is I completely agree with both.
Fair enough. Yeah, I do understand that the new mining legislation is underway, but that's even being somewhat closer to that process. Even I'm still uncertain about any kind of timeline or anything like that. All right, moving on to another question here. We'll try and get as many as we can in the short time we have. Someone asked a question related to land use planning and new mining legislation. And basically, I'm paraphrasing, but should land use planning come before or after the new mining legislation?
Ooh, that's a good question. To be honest, this is just my personal opinion. Land use planning should be given the priority because we can do it now. We've got, 2.5 land use plans, the Peel, the North Yukon, and the Dawson plan sort of almost done. And it also addresses a variety of other sectors. So it's not just mining, it's forestry, it's agriculture, it's protected parks, so it's gathering a whole bunch of Yukon values, whereas it could be argued the new mineral legislation is just mining. So my personal preference would be land use planning and then new mineral legislation, but we should be able to do both. I mean, it's not rocket science. It's just people
Isn't
in
that
room.
the key, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, when I first read this question, my first impulse was, given how long it's taken for new mining legislation, we should not abandon that in favor of putting the other forward. But given how long Chief Hope has been dealing, just as an example, with land use planning, we shouldn't abandon that in favor of waiting for new mining legislation. And so, how potentially do we write new mining legislation that says, hey, when land use plans are put into place, when they are enacted, when they're in force, those must be considered forward, right? Like, can we not do something like that allows both processes to move forward? Kate, what do you think?
Yeah, well, the reality is we wouldn't be in this position if previous governments were committed to both land use planning and new minerals legislation, which they should have been. I think the conflicts that we're dealing with right now are really the failures of the governments of the past, to be perfectly frank. Unfortunately, land use planning is not quick. The perfect example is the Peel, which is more than a decade long. The Dawson Regional Land Use Plan, that is a multi-year process. And so I think the reality is we can't take our foot off either. We need both. We desperately need both, and as quickly as possible, which is not easy. It is, unfortunately, Lewis, kind of like rocket science. Although maybe rocket science is easier because there's rules to follow, and this one is not so clear or easy.
Fair enough.
And I just completely agree. It's been a long time coming. We're just so far in the field now. Both everything is a priority, but I've always said from the very beginning, our final agreement is a book. And typically you read a book from front to back. And I agree with Kate. Had our previous governments been serious in implementing those final agreements and upholding them in the spirit and intent they were signed from that day forward, land use planning does come before all of the sub ones: water, forestry, fish and wildlife, and renewable and non-renewable resources. So yes, ultimately it should have been followed like a book from front to back. But where we are right now is in a desperate situation that we need to start considering better tools for planning in the future. Thank you.
From the support team here, do you think we have time to squeeze in one more question, or should we wrap it there and let people move on with their day?
One more.
One more? We can do one more? Okay. So this one's sort of a combined question. So it's talking about enforcement, and so how the fact that the role of EMR in both promoting mining and enforcing the regulations is not this certainly part of this larger issue that the department seems to be taking almost an advocacy role for the industry itself rather than strictly regulatory. And so the second part of this question is, where should enforcement of mineral legislation be? Should that be under, like, within the water license under YG? Should that be a function of the water board, perhaps? Should that be a function of YESUB? Who should be enforcing? And yeah, how does EMR fit into this? Go.
Okay, I'll leap in if you want. Yeah, it's often been a concern that EMR is both a promoter and a regulator. A very short-term fix would be to separate the function, make EMR the licensing authority, but do the testing and enforcement, give it over to the Department of Environment. Another way to do that is, well, why not give it to the appropriate First Nation government? It's their land, their water. They should, they could have the power and authority to enforce the various licenses and regulations associated with a mining project. The water board issues a license and has no staff or capacity to do on-the-site testing or enforcement, but that could also be another way to go because they're governed by federal legislation, so they're separate from all the political shenanigans involved within various Yukon government departments.
I think this question for me is one that I have asked myself a long time. So if you look to the Westray mine disaster in Nova Scotia, where the Nova Scotia government was both the promoter and the regulator of mines, and it led to really terrible decisions that led to the death of a whole bunch of people in an underground mine explosion, and that is always going to be at the heart of the question: is can you both promote and regulate, right? Can you encourage the development by also making sure it meets those responsibilities? Under the Yukon Party, there was a decision to move actually water and water testing, and it moved from environment actually to EMR. And at the time, I said it was like the fox guarding the hen house, right? You got to have that separation. As for where the best place is for that enforcement, I'm going to say I actually think promotion shouldn't be within energy, mines, and resources. I think promotion should be maybe that's in the executive council office, or maybe that's economic development. We move it all the way from the actual like nuts and bolts of it, but leave the professionals and the folks who know the things within energy, mines, and resources. All those public servants who have that knowledge, leave them to doing the business of that. But there's going to be lots of different opinions on this, and I'm interested to know. Chief Hope, what do you think?
Ultimately, taking into consideration what you just said, we're going to have a whole bunch of different perceptions depending on who you're talking to. I truly believe that the Eagle failure right now could be used to help get through that process. And ultimately, that is why the First Nation of Na-Cho Nyäk from day one have asked for a public inquiry. The independent inquiry that is they're doing right now just doesn't dig deep enough to answer those questions. And for me, as a Yukoner, not just as a First Nation person, but as a Yukoner, I would like to see that public inquiry done so that we could make sure that this does not happen again. We have to find the root of the problem, right back to all of the processes that led and approved this mine to occur, and make sure that we don't do this again. Taxpayers are paying for far too much in the Yukon now, and it's time to start taking better care of our resources, including higher stakes in the water, because without water, we're all dust. Thanks.
It definitely just seems strange to have those who are responsible for regulation also responsible for the success of the industry that they're regulating, and also responsible for the monitoring of the compliance of that industry that they're also responsible for the success of. It just seems to me that if I were asking someone to do something for me, I wouldn't also ask them to be accountable for it. That seems flawed.
It's all
But
tied up, right? It's all in a weird cycle for sure.
mhm. And I also know, for just last little comment here, that when I have someone else holding me accountable, I tend to perform better. I'd like to imagine that I can, get out there and do everything I want to do on my own with no oversight. But when someone else is checking in, we're working on a project together, I tend to perform better than alone. So I think what we're talking about here is not, which some people might interpret as a stance very against mining. That's utterly untrue. That's a foolish notion that we could survive without mining. Mining is a critical industry in the modern world. It's myopic to suggest otherwise. But without responsible regulation, we have so much uncertainty, and we potentially have so much harm done to stakeholders. The more we can get that responsible, equitable regulation, the more certainty we can offer in the process. The more certainty, I understand those shareholder types really appreciate that. So what we are really talking about is a solid future for everyone involved here.
Including our future generations.
Precisely.
All right,
All
Colin.
right, y'all. Thank you so much.
Seconds. I got 2 seconds.
Please.
Thanks. So today we opened up a conversation, and the Yukon NDP were interested to hear your views going forward. So we want to know what your questions are about sustainable mining, whether you're coming from an industry perspective, an environmental perspective, a community perspective. And then what questions do you think need to be asked and answered by Yukon government so that mining activities happen in a way that all Yukoners can feel good about? How can mining have true public acceptance and social license grounded in informed consent of the First Nations and the people of Yukon? So as elected folks, the Yukon NDP have a responsibility to Yukoners. So we want to hear what concerns you about mining and development in the Yukon. Again, industry perspective, environmental, community perspective. What do you think would work better? So thank you so much for everyone who attended, and in particular, Chief Hope and Lewis and Colin. Thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation with me and to share your thoughts with all of us. So with that, I thank you for joining us today for Let's Talk Mining.
Thank you.
Appreciate it
Have
all.
a good day.